Welcome to the council culture discussion / debate that I'll be having with Andrew Allison today. Thing is, you never quite know when these videos begin. Welcome to the council culture. Yes, it has fitted on time. It's the first time I've timed that well. And I'm just doing some housekeeping, as always, when I do these YouTube things. I apologize now for the camera looking a bit faded. I tried to fix that and some while the other day, and I didn't get anywhere. So unfortunately, you're going to have to bear with me on that. But otherwise, all well. And if you just give me another few moments, I will. Anyway, this is a good time if you've just started tuning in live and it's not yet 11 o'clock to quickly get yourself a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is. But yes, it'll be an interesting discussion. I think it'll probably be a bit more freewheeling at the moment, but we will see. Oh, here we go. As I said, just please bear with me for a short while because I am simply doing some house keeping, and yes. So as I wait for Andrew, it's I feared I was going to run late, but I think in sort of dashing around, I've ended up being 5 minutes earlier on everything than I intended to be, which is no bad thing. It means I've got to keep the airtime flowing. So yes, for those of you who don't know, Andrew and I have been doing these discussions for debates for a few months now. And yeah, it's we basically do them once a month, either at the start or an end of a month, usually at the end of a month. And this one is will be about cancel culture, the effects of cancel culture, and basically in its myriad forms, but I think mainly in platforming, whether you know platform people. And yes, it's basically there. And yeah, I hopefully will see where that goes. Previous discussions we've had, which are more than, are in the archives so that you can look for, is we discussed lobbying and with Boris Johnson. We discussed the results of the local elections and the Scottish, well, the whole UK elections last month. We also, if I remember, discussed, debated the EU and UK relations, where the UK is going as a country, coronavirus, and the situation in the United States in January, where we're pretty much on one hymn sheet there. I come from a left of centre perspective. I'm fairly moderate. Andrew is perhaps he isn't perhaps, he is a libertarian right winger. Not amazingly so, but he's been involved in the Taxpayers Alliance, and he's currently of the Freedom Association. So that should give you something of Andrew's politics. My politics, I was in the Labour Party for nearly 20 years, and I left over Jeremy Corbyn. Not immediately. I believe in fighting your corner where you can. But there came a point where I think in the start of 2019, things just got too much. I didn't join Change UK or anything like that, but I've been in a politically neutral position ever since. So, yes, I think that's my situation there. Yeah. And, but this is not just a discussion between Andrew and me. Do feel free to join in, either leaving comments on my YouTube page if you're watching there, or on my blog post, which if you're watching, and please don't hesitate to add your comments and suggestions and arguments. And hopefully if you're doing this live, I'll be able to see what you're saying, and I'll be able to pick it up on it and add it into my debate/discussion with Andrew, and we'll see where it all goes from there. So yes, all great fun. And here he is. Bang, well, 1 minute early. Good morning, Andrew. Yeah. Hello.
Hello, Paul.
Hello. You got your coffee in. I barely had a chance. I was rushing around. Time was running ahead of me of everything this morning, and then I was rushing around, and then I suddenly found out about 5 minutes to kill. So dead air with our viewers, and sort of saying, you know, where you're from politically, where I'm from politically, and what we've discussed in the past. So, and
well, I'm just going to nip and put a light on because I'm realizing I'm looking rather dark. So I'm just going to do that. That's always a little bit better.
Well, you should have left it off, and if you had a white cat, you could have had that, and that would have aided my arguments no end.
Oh,
yeah, as I say, we're about to discuss cancel culture, and it's a pretty wide subject. But I think a lot of what we might be touching on today is about platforming and no platforming and things around that. Just in brief, to kick us off, how do you see that cancel culture?
Sorry, could you say that again, Paul? I didn't quite catch it.
Sorry, in brief, how do you define cancel culture, and how do you see it?
Well, I mean, cancel culture can be many different things. I mean, you've mentioned no platforming at universities. I mean, which should be the bastions of free speech and debate, where people should be open to different ideas and learn how to argue against ideas that they disagree with, but in a respectful way. But I mean, other examples of it is the cricketer Ollie Robinson, who, when he was 18 years old, made some very stupid juvenile tweets. And you get these keyboard warriors, I think, must lead very, very sad lives, trawling through people's social media posts from years gone by, and then decided to release the details of those tweets on the day that he debuted for England in a test match. He's apologised. Yet the ECB have run scare. I mean, the ECB, the England and Wales Cricket Board, just for a bit of background information, never really seemed to be all that bothered about racism in the sport. It used to make a few noises in that direction, but it now seems to have just gone completely the other way, and is crucifying players for anything that they may have said on social media. And that is very annoying. You know, if someone said something when they're very young, they've apologized for saying those things, then just let's move on. Or do we not believe in redemption? If we don't believe in redemption, then I'm afraid all of us are damned.
That is true. It's like that line in the Bible, Lord, if you mark our transgressions, who will stand? But it's the thing about, do you think the ECB are overcompensating for stopping the ball? Yeah.
Yeah, well, without a doubt. There are some cricketers. I think one cricketer in particular who they haven't revealed the details of, who said something when they were even younger than that, so about 15 or 16 years old. I mean, I'm just pleased that social media wasn't around when I was that age. Now, I'm not saying I would have made racist comments, because I wouldn't have done. I know that I wouldn't have done. But at the same time, I'm sure I could have said many things at that time that could have offended people, that, judging by the standards of today, were inappropriate. And that's one thing that we need to discuss as well, because you can't judge historical figures or things that were said 20, 30 years ago by the standards that we have today. But I'm sure something would have cropped up on social media, and I'm sure someone would have been saying something about me.
But do you think it sometimes works both ways? Do you think that there's cancel culture operating on the right as well? I heard something a few days ago where someone was effectively not allowed on GB News.
I haven't read the story, to be honest. I haven't seen that.
No, and I'm trying to look it up before I came. But what I'm trying, hopefully, if someone's watching, they'll probably know and they'll say something. But if we ignore that for a moment, just go for wider argument, don't you think it works both ways? Don't you think there have been elements of this on the right as well?
Look, I'm a free speech campaigner. I believe in free speech for everyone. I mean, if you watched GB News on Sunday evening on Dan Wootton's show, the transgender activist India Willoughby said that she felt that the station was full of hate and against trans people. Well, I personally haven't seen any of that. And she was asked to give examples, and they weren't particularly strong examples that she gave. But GB News do not, at least the last time I checked, which was a couple of days ago, GB News had not put that particular show back on catch up, which it puts every show on catch up. Now, you can't go around defending free.
What I was referring to as to why it didn't put that show.
Well, I don't know why it didn't. Probably to save their blushes, maybe. I don't know the answer to that. You would have to ask them. But do I agree with the decision? No, I don't. You can't be a champion of free speech and then pick and choose. That it doesn't work like that, I'm afraid. Everyone has a right to free speech. If people disagree with what you're doing on your particular television program, then let the public decide.
Is there any area where you would think someone shouldn't be on a panel or a platform? Is there anywhere where you would rather? Is there a point where you think that's enough? I'm not having that.
Well, some people thought that about Nick Griffin on Question Time all those years ago. And I think we're going back about 12, 13 years now.
Yeah.
The BBC was heavily criticised for allowing Nick Griffin a platform to appear on that particular programme. But he basically self-combusted, didn't he? People saw what his arguments were, and they rejected those arguments. And the BNP has never been the same again, thank goodness. So in many ways, that oxygen of publicity and allowing people to be able to express their views, if they're particularly vile and particularly horrid, then just let the court of public opinion decide. And the majority of people will reject those ideas. And ultimately, it will be damaging for the person or persons who are making those particularly vile comments.
I do see that. I mean, I remember watching that myself, and I do remember when he really lost what little support he had when he said that he accepted that the Holocaust happened from radio messages found rather than the actual full-on, evidence that we've seen, that's ready available. So I do see an argument for that. I do wonder whether there is I've almost lost my train of thought because I was about to lead on to something else and I should have gone straight into it. With regards to the situation with are people acceptable, aren't they? And there's the court of public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And we mentioned Nick Griffin, this is where I was coming to. There is a fear that that doesn't always work like that. It's assuming the fundamental decency and goodness of human beings in general.
Mhm.
When you only have to watch a Nuremberg rally to know that that doesn't always happen.
Well, yes, but that is an extreme example, and that was in the 1930s. So we're approaching, 90 plus years ago, or just under 90 years ago. We have other laws, excuse me, in place. So if anybody is breaking the law, is inciting violence, are issuing death threats, are trying to take away basically the freedoms of other people to lead their lives without fear on a daily basis, then of course that has overstepped the mark, and those things are rightly illegal. I mean, there are other things that maybe people don't always think about, but if, for example, someone walks a particular route from their home to, let's say, a bus stop each morning, and every morning there is someone hurling some form of abuse at them that will force them to change their route, or perhaps they can't really change their route. That isn't the person who is being abusive is not exercising their right to free speech. They're taking away the freedom of somebody else to be able to go about their business in a perfectly lawful way, and of course that is illegal. So I mean, there are always exceptions. It's just that when it comes to free speech, my bar is extremely high. And I believe that, no matter how offensive sometimes people are, they have a right to express their opinions, because if you prevent them from expressing their opinions in general, then it means it drives these sort of things underground, and it can become more pernicious.
I mean, that's the case. I mean, I think you and I are arguing in some cases the same things from different angles and where there are details. And I think a lot of people would as well. But I mean, to use a stereotypical unpleasant right-wing, extreme right-wing argument, to use your example, couldn't it be argued that the person who had to change their route was a snowflake?
Not if they're receiving continued systematic abuse. And of course, it depends what that abuse is as well. I'm particularly thinking of abuse that will be of a racist variety, or because of the person's sexuality, things along those lines. No one should have to endure systematic abuse. That is not part of a free society, because it is taking away somebody else's freedom.
It's a fair point. Do you feel as a country that we are heavily getting more into cancel culture, or do you think things have been a level playing field for a while, or do you think it's an ebb and flow situation?
I think it's getting worse, and I thought that it would sort of disappear, because it is much worse in the United States than it is here, but it's progressively getting worse here. We hear of all sorts of different stories. I mean, there was the mature law student at university in Dundee, who said in one of the online tutorials that women were not as strong as men, something as simple as that, and she was reported to the university authorities. Eventually, she was cleared, but she went through quite a few weeks of not knowing whether she was going to be kicked off a course when she was just about to graduate. There are different examples like this, and there are some very strong lobbies in this country. Now, I'm not bothered what people want to be. If people want to transition a man to a woman to a man, that's absolutely fine with me. I've got no problem with that. I want people to be happy in general, and if they're not particularly happy, and if they're really miserable and suffering from mental health problems as a result of being so depressed, then of course we should be helping people. But when someone says, it was J.K. Rowling, wasn't it, when she said the word that you're looking for is a woman, or that women don't breastfeed anymore, they chest feed, and somehow or other you can't say mothers, because it's just I can't even remember what term some people were saying. When you're stating the bleeding obvious, for example, that women give birth to children, and that is somehow seen as being controversial, and then you get some activists who are really, really determined to make sure that your opinions are shut down. Well, that is not free speech. People have a right to argue against that, and I will argue against them, but they don't have a right to be able to shut someone down, to make their life hell, to try and get them fired from their job, and lose any right to voice their views.
You say it happens it's worse in the United States. It's a horribly polarized country at the moment, something we touched on in our first discussion. Do you see any signs of hope over there? And do you see any signs of hope over in the UK?
I don't see any signs of hope, particularly in the United States at the moment. Signs of hope in the UK, well, I hope some sort of good old-fashioned British common sense will start coming to the fore. I mean, if you look at the Black Lives Matter protests and some of the things that those protesters were saying about the UK police, which didn't bear any resemblance to the truth. We know that by and large, British people tend to be a lot more tolerant, a lot more welcoming. And so just me saying this, I hear this from people who are of mixed race or of black, come from other ethnicities who don't seem to have really a problem with the UK. But we know that the USA is still a deeply racist country. I mean, the evidence is there all around. Lest we forget that when those the protest was going on with Rosa Parks in Montgomery in Alabama, and Martin Luther King Jr. was starting to come to the fore. This was just around about 70 years ago. It's not that long ago. And there are many states where institutional racism is very, very strong. So let's not try to pretend that somehow or other, just because we happen to speak the same language and that we're, well, more or less, I think Americans gave up with adverbs years ago, but just because we more or less speak the same language and we're allies, that somehow or other our societies are very similar, because they are not.
Yes. I mean, I remember once, I think a previous British ambassador to Washington, when he arrived, he had a pep talk with the staff, which, wasn't unusual. But what was unusual and which amused the staff was when the first things he said is, what you need to constantly bear in mind is the United States and the United Kingdom are two different countries. And the United States is a separate country. And of course, they all laugh because they thought, well, no brainer, yes, of course. But that's obviously not what he meant. What he meant was, because we share a common language, because we are familiar with each other's culture, we tend to think that we're both the same. And we're in many ways, we're two very different countries. And I think, as you said, you've hit the nail on the head there. What do you, I mean, you mentioned about good old-fashioned common sense. I mean, I tend to take the pendulum viewpoint that things will reach a certain point and then there'll be a backlash and things will move back. Do you think that where do you think things can change, perhaps? But I mean, what do you think will be the driving force of change? And how do you think it got to this stage in the first place?
To answer your first question, universities, and I had a meeting, it was a telephone meeting, as meetings are on telephones or on Zoom these days, with someone who works in external relations from the Russell Group of universities. That was just over a year ago. And they certainly are keen, the Russell Group, to end the universities in their group being certainly seen as institutions which do cancel speakers, will no platform them. King's College London, which does not have a particularly great reputation when it comes to these things, is also trying to change as well. The government, Gavin Williamson, about the only good thing that Gavin Williamson has done, or indeed has said, in the in this time as education secretary, he is trying to legislate. Now, I'm a little bit wary about legislation. I always am. I don't think we should have the need to legislate, but if necessary, then maybe that is the route. So certainly, if universities can become much more open and be what they're designed to do, which is to be the home of free and frank debate, then we've got a chance of moving forward. But don't you think that we live in what can best be described as a highly risk-averse society? And I think COVID has worsened this problem, but it was definitely there before. When I was a child, I could play on a climbing frame in a local recreation ground, and if I fell off that climbing frame, I would land on concrete. I could bruise myself and do myself a bit of damage, but of course, my parents wouldn't dream of suing anyone for the damage that I've done. But we live in such a risk-averse society now that we wrap children up in cotton wool, and it's not just for things like going out to play anymore. It's we wrap them up in cotton wool when it comes to ideas. We don't want them too upset. And this is going on throughout the education system in this country. So when they actually finally reach university, they've never really been challenged. They've never had their thoughts and their ideas challenged. And this is part of the problem, and that needs to change.
I think there's things I both agree with and disagree with in what you said. I mean, I think of the two. My dad was a bank manager, so he moved every few years in my first part of my childhood. Mm-hmm. But he, when I was spent the first primary school I went to is in an area that will be familiar to a number of politicos, where it was a primary school in Enstone in Oxfordshire, which is just a few miles from Chipping Norton. And I remember in the playground, I loved them at the time. There was a climbing frame which all the girls used, and all the boys used these two large remains of oak trees, and there was this hollowed out oak tree. It was almost like a hobbit place. I'd probably slightly tower over it now, but of course, if you're 5 to 8 years old, where you could just about hunch in, you could go in there. And I remember my first day of school. My one memory of my first day at school, I was hovering around on the roof of that, having got out of what was like a chimney. It was a real hollowed out thing. Those things don't exist anymore. And I know they don't. They're no longer at that school. I also know when I went to junior school, there was like I said, climbing frame on concrete. And when I was in my second year at that junior school, in Baldock in Hertfordshire, I climbed across. There was a ladder going the horizontal. As I was climbing across, I missed and fell through, and I hit my head on the concrete. Mm. Thankfully, I only had a bruise and a headache, and was sent home, kept an eye on for observation. There was nothing more than that. Mm. It could have been a lot worse.
Yes,
I could have ended up with severe concussion. I could have ended up with brain injury if I'd gone from a higher height. Now, if that had happened, I'm sure my parents would be dreaming of suing, because they would be angry that their son had got there. I think that you are right. We are too risk averse. I think sometimes we went perhaps from one extreme to perhaps we were a little bit too blasé in the past, and we ended up being too extreme. I mean, frankly, when I was at the first school in Enstone, there weren't, when I was there, any accidents. But it's, you only have to have one misfortune.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you come to a children's playground now, and you walk on some of the surfaces, and it's so springy. It's like a mattress.
Yeah,
and of course that's a much better thing. I'm not particularly defending the fact that we used to land on concrete. I'm just trying to use it as an example of the parents were perfectly happy for their children to climb climbing frames, to go up trees, and if they fell down and if they hurt themselves, well, that's all part of growing up. It's all part of life. Whereas now, it is everyone, councils particularly who run these type of playgrounds are absolutely terrified that a child will get a bruise. And so the pendulum has swung completely from, yes, maybe a little bit more blasé and not caring as much, to the point where we just don't even want children to be children anymore.
I mean, as I said, I agree and disagreed with what you had said in that statement. I mean, with university, I think about going there and risk averse, that there is a truth. I mean, when I was at university, when things were a little different, part of the way I found everyone interacted with everyone when I was there was everyone came from a variety of backgrounds, not just social backgrounds, but cultural backgrounds, and not just social and cultural backgrounds, but what your general viewpoint of the world is. And that can be with almost any, I mean, you go to any, I mean, when you and I were growing up and we're perhaps similar ages, it was, you had the kids whose families watched ITV, and you had the families whose kids watched BBC.
Yes, you did.
You always had the token 2 or 3 kids whose parents did not believe in having a TV set in home. So, there is that, we all come in there. So, yeah, I do agree that I think we are agreeing on this point, that we are perhaps too risk averse, but I think I would, say, arguing from we're perhaps a little bit too blasé, as you said, and then move to another extreme.
You also had, you're talking about the ITV BBC thing, which is so true, and I think younger people now watching it will find it hard to believe.
Yeah.
But it is true, and it also extended because, of course, there was no such thing as rolling news. There's no such thing as the internet. So therefore, if you wanted to get your news, you had to either listen to the radio bulletins, or if you were in front of a television, you either had BBC News and the local news bulletins. And I always remember, that to pick up local news, there were some parents who would religiously watch Look North, where I was in the northeast of England, Look North on BBC, or Northern Life on ITV. And believe me, people did not watch both because they couldn't, they couldn't watch both at the same time pretty much, but also they never changed their habits. You either watched ITV News or you watched BBC News, and that was it.
Yeah, and I memean, when they had, I'm a little bit too young for this. I mean, I remember watching television in 1979, but as I was preschool, I don't remember things like the ITV strike that lasted 2 months, where there was a thing where people were asked, they silly as they had to watch the BBC or nothing, unless they're on the Channel Islands, where they had an ITV region still going. So, I mean, it kind of shows how different things were. But I mean, you mentioned of how 24-hour news media, I think you hit the nail on the head on a lot of the cancel culture issues there, because it's not just the 24-hour rolling news media, it's the social media. It's the internet has, I mean, I remember it was played a lot after his death, where David Bowie is interviewed on Newsnight, and he told the incredulous Jeremy Paxman, the internet is going to completely and utterly change our lives in ways that we cannot fathom or expect. And he was right.
Yes.
It has, and I do think that perhaps a lot of it maybe, I mean, Twitter and Facebook, and of course we all end up in our own, to a degree, we all form our own cancel culture, where if we find someone a little bit too much to handle, we tend not to follow them, and we tend to prefer following people who, even if we disagree with them, we find certainly perhaps congenial to a certain extent, or we can cope with them. And I think that does perhaps play a major part in that.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is basically a sewer. I would not be on Twitter if it wasn't for my job. Ian Dale has spoken about that recently as well, and I'm completely with him. The amount of times I've wanted to come off Twitter but felt that I couldn't because of the work that I do and the way that helps promote what I do. But if I wasn't doing what I do, I wouldn't be on Twitter, or I certainly wouldn't be on every day, maybe occasionally, because it is a pretty awful environment. I just saw something earlier today. It was something to do with, I think, the UEFA people coming across, and these VIPs, 2,500 VIPs who are just free to come across into our country because they happen to be sponsors and senior people in European football. And someone had made a comment that I half agreed with. I felt that he should have gone on and said something else. And you just look down at the comments and someone says, "You moron, what are you," and straight away instead of saying, well, actually, you may be slightly right there, or I may disagree with you on that, but have you thought of this? No, people just don't want to say that. You just get straight into personal abuse, and it is a pretty horrid place.
I mean, I liken it. I mean, I try and be careful on Twitter. I find I never thought of it in this analogy until just a few moments ago. I tend to see Twitter in the same way where you live, you know, a local town or a hometown. I mean, it might be a case of a village, but I don't think so. Where in a town, you know which areas you want to visit, which areas you like to visit, you're okay about passing through, and there is one or two areas which you avoid because it's a crime rate's quite high, or because you just don't like that part of the town, or whatever. And I find Twitter's like that.
Well, I find that you could live in the nicest possible area, but there are always some scumbags that are going to come and try and rob your house. And I think Twitter's a little bit like that. You can be perfectly getting on quite nicely. You're interacting with people who you've got to know. You may disagree with them from time to time, but everything's done in a perfectly congenial, harmonious way. And then you get people just coming straight onto your timeline who are determined to spoil the experience for everybody.
I do remember the worst time was 2014, where someone made a very nasty allegation about Ed Miliband, I suspect in the context as a joke. And I didn't vote for Ed, I voted for David. But at a time when I thought, when there was everything to play for, I was perhaps a bit more sensitive to anything about everything. And I thought this was I thought this was a step too far. What I should have done was silently reported them to Twitter, because it went beyond the rules of Twitter. But no, I challenged that person on it, and the abuse I got that evening from tweet after tweet after tweet from Emma, that's the only time on Twitter in the 12 years that I've been the subject of a pile-on, and it was horrible.
Yeah, actually, I've had a couple of them. They're not particularly pleasant. I do report quite a few, but I do have strict standards on that. I mean, as I said, my bar to free speech is high. But if anyone ever tries to sort of say, we know where you live, or to anybody, or says you should be killed, I hope you die a horrible death, anything like that, I immediately report. And I have to say, very, very rare I've ever reported it on my behalf. It tends to be because I think somebody else shouldn't have to put up with that. There's got to be a standard of debate. Another thing to do with Twitter as well is anonymous accounts. I mean, they really, really annoy me.
Well, it's a sign of cowardice on some of them, isn't it?
It's what? Sorry, say that again.
Sign of cowardice on some of them.
Oh, what it is, and they hide behind it. I mean, there's one particular left-wing account. I won't name because I may get it wrong, actually, because there's a few of them, but so I don't want to get the wrong one here. But I've said, who are you? I said, you know who I am. I said, I'm perfectly open with who I am. You know who I work for. You know what I do. You know what my views are. I'm accountable to everybody who interacts with me, in the sense that they can find me. And I don't mean a horrible way, but they know who I am. Who are you, hiding behind some sort of pseudonym, or pretending that you are, the community representative of wherever you live? So I keep saying, who are you? And of course, they will never, ever reveal themselves. Now, it could be because they're in a politically sensitive job. They're a senior civil servant who can't reveal themselves. It could be something like that. Or it could be that if they did, they would get into serious trouble. But it does make you wonder why people hide behind these pseudonyms all the time, and even when challenged, refuse to even sort of tell you where they live. And I don't mean their address. I mean, do you live in the southwest of England even?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be sensitive online for obvious reasons as to, where I live, etc. Or no, it shouldn't. I don't go to the extent of. I mean, you only have to go on the Twitter accounts, and I live in Hertfordshire. So I mean, that's not saying never mention where I live, but I just see it as good common sense to be a tiny bit cautious. But I mean, it does kind of say something, doesn't it? Where you're like, you won't even say which part of the country you're in. But I mean, but I mean, with all this in mind, I mean, you talk about freedom of speech. You mention what a sewer Twitter is, and you mention, I mean, we've both said of how the internet has kind of perhaps inflamed cancel culture. The irony that comes to mind then which seems to be the logical conclusion, is should there be a degree of censorship on social media?
I know there should be censorship. I just think there needs to be strict rules. I think there needs to be strict rules on Twitter. I mean, I think Twitter, for example, the company, it seems to be very tolerant of people who are willing to hurl vile abuse and say, "I hope you get raped." Watch. I mean, that is probably one of the worst. You deserve to be raped. I mean, right-thinking person could ever say to somebody else, a woman in particular, obviously, you should be raped. I mean, it's utterly horrid. Now, as soon as anyone says that, Twitter should be saying off.
Yeah.
But of course, what they can do then is they'll create a new email address if they haven't got one already, and they'll set themselves up with another sort of fake account, and they'll start again. And quite frankly, they can keep on doing that for as long as they're allowed to do so. I just think that when it comes to social media, I mean, your Facebook, for example, you know who the person is. You've got to register with an email address. You've got to say who you are with Facebook. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a lot better than Twitter is. I just think people should not have anonymity unless they can prove to Twitter that they need anonymity. Otherwise, we should know who people are, and they should just be kicked off the platform for any abuse that is basically criminal. I mean, saying that you should be raped is a threat. It's a threat of physical violence and sexual violence against the person, against somebody else, and that cannot be tolerated. It can't.
Well, I mean, when after the riots on the Capitol in 6th of January, Donald Trump was removed because it was believed that his tweets were seen as incitement. And I tend to think, I mean, to be fair, in the argument against that, they did put up with Trump longer than I would have thought necessary. And he did it. Everyone knew he only had a fortnight of the presidency to go. But I do think if you can cancel the president, if you can remove the president of the United States from Twitter, and people said on that's cancel culture. And my argument at the time, and my argument still stands, no, that's not cancel culture. There are rules, and Donald Trump fell foul of the rules.
He did, and we discussed this, I think, the beginning of the year, didn't we?
Yeah.
We discussed this going on. Although the one thing I will say is that I don't think he directly incited violence. I mean, I think it's what he meant. I think he meant people to go to the Capitol and storm the Capitol. I do think that that's exactly what he meant, but he didn't specifically use the words. So I think if it was going to a court of law, it probably couldn't be proved.
No.
But you are right in the principle of it. Let's not get on to Donald Trump anymore. Thank goodness we don't have to discuss him. But if they can, remove a sitting president of the United States, and now former president of the United States, then surely they can deal with some people who are going around trolling ordinary people and issuing the most horrible threats. It must be possible.
Yes, indeed. So, do you think that with the we did discuss with social media that, perhaps we need to see more tightening of the rules. I do think, as we come to the end of this, we do look at, I think we've probably been arguing the same things from different angles at some points. But I do think there's a degree of hope, don't you think?
I'm an optimistic person. I always am. My glass is always half full. It's how I like to lead my life. So yes, I do think that we can, but I just think we have to keep on defending the right of genuine free speech and promote debate, promote healthy disagreement. We're not going to agree on everything. It's impossible. Nobody agrees with everything that everybody that somebody else stands for. You can agree with 99.9%, but there's always going to be something that makes you disagree with somebody else. And it's not arguing for the sake of arguing, but if you've got ideas and you want to present those ideas, then you should be freely allowed to do them. And somebody else should be allowed to robustly argue against you, and then go to the pub afterwards and have a pint. And that's the way that it should be. I remember a story. It was somebody who I got to know very well, and I've stayed with them. They're an elderly couple now. They live in Normandy, and I used to work with him. And he was telling me that back in the sort of 1950s, his mother, who was a conservative activist in Birmingham, he said every time the Conservatives won, she'd be on a high, and every time the Conservatives lost, she'd be down and depressed. She was so involved in politics. And their local MP, a Conservative MP, took a group of them to the Houses of Parliament, and they went in Strangers' Gallery, and they watched this debate. And there was one Conservative MP and one Labour MP, and they were at it like cat and mouse. I mean, they were arguing, issuing insults to each other. It was going on. And she really rather liked that, especially as she thought the Conservative MP was winning over the Labour man. And they went downstairs to have a drink with their MP. And she saw those two MPs, the Conservative MP and the Labour MP, had just been arguing on the floor of the House of Commons, having a laugh and a joke and a drink together. And she couldn't work out how that was possible.
It's like that sketch, not the 9 o'clock news satirized, where you see two politicians on a talk show literally screaming at each other.
Yes.
And one of them suddenly drops dead of a heart attack, and then immediately a fulsome tribute is brought by the other.
Yes, he was a really decent man, wasn't he? Heart in the right place, and all the rest of it. But look, I mean, I'm actually reading an autobiography at the moment, and it's an old one. It's from 1987 of Tip O'Neill, who was the former Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives for 10 years. Which is,
I know where you're going with this because I think I've heard, but go on.
But you probably have heard this one. But for the benefit of viewers, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could exchange insults like the best of them. I mean, even in this autobiography, I haven't got this far yet, but I know it's in. He described Ronald Reagan as the worst president there ever was. It was sinful that he ever got elected. Ronald Reagan sometimes used to joke. He said, "I received a Valentine's Day card from Tip O'Neill. So I knew it was from Tip because I had a bleeding heart." And the two of them were there. But the two of them really got on well with each other and respected each other and respected each other's officers, if nothing else. And after 6 p.m., they were friends. They always used to say that. Everything else before 6 p.m. was politics. After 6 p.m., they could sit in the Oval Office, the White House, have a drink together, exchange old Irish stories, both are Irish Americans, and could get on well with each other. And politics actually did work. And there's actually a good book by Chris Matthews, who used to work for Tip O'Neill. Certainly not my politics. Well, Tip O'Neill's not my politics, as you know. Yeah. But he wrote a book called Tip and the Gipper, when politics worked. And Tip O'Neill accepted that in 1980, the American people had decisively, a little surprise to them, but decisively voted for Ronald Reagan and his agenda. So therefore, they would speak against what that agenda was, but they would never block it because they respected the fact that Ronald Reagan had received a mandate. And both of them respected each other and managed to get on with business and still remain on very good terms. And when it comes to free speech, this is how it should be, and it should be like this all the time. Now, perhaps I'm describing a utopia here that is not going to exist, but certainly this is the way that we should be moving. We shouldn't be cancelling other people's opinions. Just because we disagree with them doesn't mean that people don't have a right to hold those opinions. The only exception, as I've mentioned before, is when you start being really vile and abusive on a continued basis. You start issuing threats against people. Well, that is a complete abuse of free speech, and there are rightly laws against people doing that. Everything else is just open season as far as I'm concerned.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it. Thank you very much, Andrew. And hopefully we've put some of the world to rights, if not all of it.
Well, a little bit.
All right. Well, thank you very much and have a good rest of the week.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.